So we're on Parshas Vayechi, the last parsha in this book, page 268, and it's really the conclusion. It brings us to the end of the lives of the forefathers, and even into the the next stage of the passing of even some of the next generation. So it begins by telling us Vayechi Yaakov be'eretz Mitzrayim. Yaakov lived in the land of Egypt. It says here Sheva Asara Shana, right, 17 years. Vayime Yaakov Shnei Chayav Sheva Shanim Arbim. It goes through how old he was, 147 years old, and he's about to die. Right, and it says that he calls for Yosef, his son, to come, and he wants him to take an oath that he will make sure that after he dies, that he's not buried in Egypt, and that he's brought up into the land of Israel, so he could be buried with his forefathers, our forefathers as well. And so it begins, and then Yosef promises him. And then we have immediately the very interesting blessing that is given by Yaakov to his grandchildren. And oddly enough, it's the only of his grandchildren that received this blessing. All the other people who get blessings are his children. And we'll see as we go through the Parsha how each one of them are blessed individually and collectively. But here the two grandchildren are blessed, and it says that they're blessed because Yaakov tells Yosef, it's because they're like my children. They are, right, your children are to be like my children. So they're grandchildren, but they're like children. Mm-hmm. So the commentaries right away ask, what is that telling us? What does that mean that you have these grandchildren who are to me like my children? And we learn a couple of interesting points from this, which is that there's a concept that we know of, which is called Yeridat Hadoros, which means the lessening of the generations, which we know in our era that the further away a person is from the giving of the Torah, the less the innate spiritual capabilities of that person is. That is, for instance, our great-grandparents. Our great-grandparents had innately within them greater spiritual capabilities or spiritual potential than we do, simply because of when they were born. Now, not necessarily on an individual basis, but on a general basis. The closer you are to when the giving of the Torah was, the greater the spiritual capabilities were. So that a person who was in that era, very close to that, right, were able to do spiritual things that we can't do, or that we think we don't even imagine, and which were commonplace. Now, of course, this is before the giving of the Torah, but we have a similar idea that there is also a lessening that that Adam, being created directly by God, had a direct relationship with God, and Noah coming after, and each generation after that also lessened to some extent. And we find this idea with Fri May and Manasseh, which are grandchildren to Yaakov, would therefore have somewhat of less of a spiritual potential than their father, who was one generation closer to Yaakov, right? And yet Yaakov says that your children, my grandchildren, are like children to me. And the commentary tells us that this is saying that Fri May and Manasseh were extraordinary in a number of ways, but one of the results of how extraordinary they became was that they actually were among the very few individuals in the history of the world who exceeded their potential. That is to say, in normal circumstances, right, it's very hard for any one of us to fulfill our potential. In other words, we have a potential. God gives us potential. And for us to fulfill that takes an enormous amount of work, to work on ourselves, to do things to fulfill our potential. Right? We get tired, we get lazy, we get ill, all types of things happen to us which hold us back, or which we imagine hold us back, or we allow ourselves to be held back from reaching our potential. But yet you have rare individuals who seem to exceed and push the envelope, so to speak, of what their potential was. You have examples of people who were underestimated, but even underestimated by people who you'd think would know better, who would be in the category. For instance, King David himself, David HaMelech. David HaMelech, when he was, when Shmuel HaNavi came and wanted to find the next leader of the Jewish people, he knew that that leader would come from one of the children of Yishai, of the man by the name of Yishai, of which David was one of them. King David was one. But yet when Yishai went and introduced to the prophet all of his children, he didn't introduce David because he couldn't imagine that David would be the one. All of the other sons he saw could have the potential to be a great leader, but David, right, this last son, he didn't see it, so he didn't even introduce him. And here the prophet is going through all the children. It's not him, it's not this one, not this one. And the prophecy finally comes to the realization with King David. So here you find a person like David HaMelech, who also rose to a level that was beyond what was anticipated of him. And Ephraim and Manasseh were like that. Now Ephraim and Manasseh, in their being like that, we learn a number of important things. The first thing, of course, is we see in the blessing that's given to them that we read about in the next page, which is the blessing that we say to our children. For many of us, we say a blessing for our children every Friday night. But certainly, even those who don't have such a custom, we know that there is a basis to do it on Erev Yom Kippur. And that prayer that is said is that that Hashem should place you, Simcha Elohim Ephraim for Manasseh, like Ephraim and like Manasseh. And everybody asks, like of all people, to say, why them? Why is it that God wants our fathers to bless our children, right, or us to bless our children, or our fathers to bless us in such a way that we should be like Ephraim and Manasseh? Why shouldn't we be like Avram and Yitzchak? Why shouldn't we be like Reuven and Shimon? Why should we be like Yaakov? Like, why these two, Yaakov and Yosef? They'll be two great ones to be like. Ephraim and Manasseh seem very odd. So there are many answers to it. One of them, of course, is because they were able to raise themselves beyond the level of the people of their generation, of the grandchildren, to a level of being among the Shvatim, of the tribes, being at the level of the previous generation. In other words, that we tell our children, you should strive to be the most that you can be, fulfill all that you can be, and not only fulfill your potential, but if you work hard enough, you'll even rise beyond that. You'll even be able to do more than that. That our potential ultimately is limitless. That Hashem gives us the ability to become great. But there's another few points that are important. As you see, that of all of the Jewish people, and to this point, the Hebrews really, the first two who are really born in exile are Ephraim and Manasseh. Right, Abraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, right, the Jewish people, or the Hebrew people, the Hebrew nation, right, is really one after another, after Abraham, of course, are born within the land of Israel, the land of Canaan, which is the land of Israel, including the sons of, or lived there, certainly lived there within the culture of the Hebrew people, were even the sons of Yaakov. Right, Yosef, all of them lived their life primarily among all of the other Hebrews, of the other Jews. So when you have all of these people living together, so of course the environment is a good environment. Here you have Reuven, for instance, living among his brothers, living with his father, living with his mothers, living in an environment which is conducive to a spiritual life, conducive to a way that ultimately a Jewish person would live. Yosef, being thrown into Egypt, has his children outside of the close-knit family of the Hebrews. He has his children in Egypt. Excuse me. And they live within Egyptian culture. Because we know that, for instance, that when the brothers come down to meet, and they meet Yosef, they don't recognize him. One of the reasons they don't recognize him, besides the fact that he's older, is that he looks like an Egyptian. He dresses like an Egyptian. So he appears to them to be like an Egyptian. So certainly his sons also looked like Egyptians, which means that while the rest of them looked like Hebrews and lived among the Hebrews and lived in an environment that was Hebrews, these two children did not. And of course, sadly, our children also do not. Our children, because of what's happened for thousands of years now, that we're in dispersion, we're thrown out of the land of Israel that has the temple and a Jewish theocracy within the land of Israel does not exist. Therefore, our children are given a blessing that they should rise to the level of being as great as Ephraim and Manasseh, who are the first two Hebrews, or two Jewish people, who are raised in the dispersion, raised outside of the close-knit Jewish family. And as they were able to succeed and to grow and to become great, so too we tell our children the same thing. That even though they're born in such a way, that they also should be blessed by God, that they should become great, even though they're forced to be raised and born and live in such a situation, which is not as optimum as we would like it to be. And so they receive that blessing. But as well, we see a very interesting thing is because the two children of Yosef, of Fri May and Menashe, are very different children than each other. One of them clearly is like the sergeant, let's say like the Secretary of State. That Yosef, who ran the country, Yosef was a politician. He was the number 2 man in the country of Egypt. He was the second most powerful person in all of Egypt. It wasn't that he sat among the Jews all the time who eventually came there, or he sat and he learned Torah. We know that Yosef was involved in running the country, and therefore his son, right, was the same way. Was Ephraim was the same way. He was sort of his second in command. He assisted him, and you see that that in a number of places where he makes reference to a young person assisting him, it's always talking about his son Ephraim, who was sort of raised to take over that position, to be the one who would then be involved in government. You have the other son, though, is Menashe. Menashe, really the firstborn son, is oddly enough, is just the opposite. We are told that Menashe lived a life of Torah. He sat and he learned and he studied. He was like Yaakov, and that he didn't spend his time involved in government. He was totally involved within a Jewish life, a Jewish lifestyle, of theology, of understanding Torah, understanding how a Jew should live, and sort of almost taking himself away from the life that his brother and his father lived in order to live his way. And here we now find 2 brothers raised by the same family, in the same culture, but yet very, very different. And there's many messages that it tells us about this. And among them is that while it might be optimum, that if we had a perfect world, we'd be living in a world where we really were totally enveloped within a Jewish lifestyle, totally enveloped within Torah, being able to live a life of doing kindness, of chesed to other people. But we're not. That's not how. It's not a perfect world. And outside of that, we have a world where a person needs to be involved. We have to be involved in the outside world. We have to understand what's going on around us. We have to understand politics. We have to understand where we're living here in Canada. We have to understand the society we're in. And we have to be able to deal with it and be able to be challenged by it and to be able to succeed in it. And this was the life of Ephraim, who was himself involved in the Egyptian society, was challenged by it, remained true to Torah, remained true to Judaism, just like his father was. And that, in a society where Jews are not always able to live totally enveloped within the blanket of Jewish life, are challenged by the society we're in. And Ephraim was able to raise himself and to be a totally committed Jew, living within a society that wasn't much like we are. Menashe, right, who lived at the same time, chose a different path. He was able to choose a path that allowed him and gave him the ability to be able to be totally enveloped in Torah, even though he was living in a foreign society. And both of these approaches are legitimate approaches. That's what the Torah is telling us, that it's the way of Ephraim and Menashe, that the way of Ephraim was to involve himself within society and yet to become totally loyal to Torah and to the way of Torah. And Menashe was to totally involve himself in Torah and Jewish life and to remain loyal to that as well. And that both of these are good approaches. And we find these differences among groups of Jews today. We find some Jews who totally involve themselves in learning Torah. They're studying in kollel, they get married, and rather than going to work, they'll necessarily go and study. They'll learn full time, and they'll be supported by the community in order to do so, and in order to be able to live and to grow and to be able to acquire more Torah knowledge, sometimes teach that Torah knowledge, but simply to acquire it and to have Torah knowledge, while others among us, right, aren't that type of a person, or not as privileged, or are different, and go out into the work world, and they become the doctors and the lawyers and the accountants and the workers who are involved in society that we live in, and yet are able to use our knowledge as Jews to be able to stay loyal to Judaism and to be honest in business and to be caring of others and to be involved in the betterment of all people. And both of these are good approaches. Therefore, we need to understand that even though our children and groups of Jews or our own children are very different from each other and will live lives that can be very different from each other, the ultimate point is that they should stay loyal to Torah. If it's that they're involved in society or they're not involved in society, both are legitimate. We often find Jews critical of one group or another, and it's important for us to remember that both are legitimate ways of doing things. There are those who will say that the Jews who sit and learn in Kollel and they live off society supports them in order for them to grow and to learn and to spend a life in such a way. For a person who has the ability to do this, has the intelligence, has the desire, has the ability to spend their life in learning, or a good portion of their life in learning, is a wonderful thing to be able to do. And it's not for everyone. We learn that in the Gemara itself, that there are few people who can accomplish a life this way. But those who can accomplish a life this way, it is a legitimate and a wonderful way to live. For the majority of Jews, they're not able to do that. The majority of Jews don't have the ability financially, or the ability to be willing to give up, or the ability to be able to apply themselves intellectually to live that way. And therefore, we go into business and we go into society, we go into careers and to professions, and we give of ourselves to society in other ways. But the similarity between the two is that they're both loyal to Torah. And therefore, when we're critical of one group and say, look at them, they don't do anything for society. They sit and learn all day, and they expect us to support them, and they don't give anything back. That's false. It's not true. They are living a life that is a dedicated Torah life, and by virtue of the fact of what they're doing, that is giving back. Either through directly giving back by their teaching, or they're being leaders or rabbis or scholars, or simply because it is necessary to have Jews who learn Torah in order to gain that knowledge and to live a spiritual life. That in and of itself is giving back. And then there are those in the other camp who say, look at the Jews who are working. They're below us. They're not as sophisticated as us. They're not as knowledgeable as us. They're not, they're the regular people. And that's also not right, because the people who are out working, who work all of the hours they do in order to make a living, who give of themselves not only to spend time with their family and to help the community, but to then take time for themselves to learn Torah, to dedicate an hour a night, 2 hours a night, 3 hours, part of a day, a couple hours a week to learn Torah, for people like that is a difficult thing to do. And for them to be committed to do that, and to give a portion of their money to tzedakah and to care for others, means that these people are doing something that's also correct. Therefore, one of the worst things that we could do is to be critical of either group, because both are legitimate. And it's one of the reasons why we see that the blessing is given for Ephraim and Manasseh. That Ephraim and Manasseh were so radically different from each other, and they represent these two streams. So that you have two very different streams among the Jewish people today. But they're both legitimate. They're both the right way. And we bless our children that whichever way you go, you should be the best you can at either way. And you should fulfill your potential in either way. But whatever it is, you should find your way, and that's the way you should be. Be in a way filled with Torah and learning all the time. You should not be wasting your time. You should not be, drinking coffee and fooling around rather than learning. You should be dedicated and doing what you need to do. And the other group who is involved with work should not only work, and they should make sure they have time for learning as well, and they should support those people who need their help, and they should be giving their charity and so forth. Those are all very, very important. And that's one of the reasons why the Parsha gives us this blessing and tells us that these are who we bless our children with. Because we need to look at the groups of Jews this way, and we have to also look at our own children, because certainly our own children are different. Right? Any of us who have children who are older than a couple of years old know that no matter the fact that they come from the same genetic background and have the same environmental life, children are different, and they want to go different ways, and they want to do different things. And as long as we give our children the self-respect, and we give them the self-worth, and the knowledge to be able to live their lives in such a way, so then they are taught to imbue their lives with Torah, and that they don't have to all be the same. If the children can be different. Interestingly enough, one of the themes that comes up here is that there's a concept in child rearing is that you should never favor a child. If you have 2, 3, 5, whatever number of children you have, you shouldn't favor one child over another, because it's only going to cause trouble. Now, we learn this very clearly from Yaakov. Even the Gemara says so, that Yaakov's problems, that Yosef was sold, that he lost Yosef for so long, that his brothers threatened to kill him, was that he favored Yosef. And you'd think that Yaakov learned this lesson, but yet he goes later in life, and he does it again. He does it with Fri May and Menashe. He goes and he favors these 2 grandchildren over all the other grandchildren. And he says, not only is Yosef my favorite, now his children are my favorite. And again, he continues to do this. And since he continues to do this, even though we know in the case of Yosef that it didn't all work out as well as it might have, and that certainly it does teach us that lesson, the fact that he does it again tells us that it's not necessarily a hard rule, that it must always be the case. Because there are times when we have to come to the realization that you can't treat your children the same. That even though you have to treat your children, that you love them all, and that each one is special, and that none of them are favored over each other, that does not mean that they have to be treated the same. Because one child might be very obedient and very studious and be able to do very well in school and to get ahead and to do whatever that child needs to do. And you don't have to spend a lot of time with them. Well, another one is more trouble and more difficulty. And if you work with that second child, you're spending more time with that second child, you compliment that second child for accomplishing things that the first one can accomplish with no issue. Nevertheless, it appears that you're favoring him, and you're not favoring him. But you are making a difference between them. They're not the same. And you are spending more time with the second than the first. Then you are rewarding the second for things that you don't reward the first for, because they are different. The education of our children are different, the personalities of our children are different, and how we deal with them is different. It's not just that our children can't be favored. That's true. But the fact that we see that Yaakov continues to do this, even after he learned the lesson of what happened with Yosef, means that Yaakov is telling us something. That yes, favoring children, right, he's saying this one is innately better because it reminds me of my mother, it reminds me of my father, he's more like me, my goals are his goals. That is not a good thing. But to say that a child is treated different than others, you need to explain it to the children why that's the case. But that's a necessity, because all of our children are different. And if we treat all of them the same, we run into a problem. In fact, the Torah tells us that one of the reasons that it appeared that Yaakov and Esau were so drastically different, and that Esau was so early in age, seemed to be going on the wrong path, it says in the Talmud that because his parents treated Yitzchak and Rivka treated Yaakov and Esau the same, raised them the same, as if they were the same child, because they were twins from the same parents, the same environment, yet they weren't the same. And if they had come to the realization that they were different, then it could have been that it wouldn't have turned out the same way. And therefore we learn that you can't favor one child over another, but you must treat your children differently, because they are different. And therefore there might be an appearance that you're favoring one. But if you explain to your children that that's not what's happening, that really what you're doing is you're educating them differently, you're working with the weaknesses and the strengths of each child independently, you are then building them to be themselves. And in the case of Fri May and Menashe, to be very, very different people. Right? And we see in the case of Yaakov that he teaches us that lesson by how he treats them. That's why I said it. Yeah.
Rabbi, like you say, I understand that you should treat the children different, of course,
Right.
But then you say, look, the main thing to me is that I'll tell them that you love them, right? Like you don't say
right.
when you love them more,
right?
The second thing is, like, for example, the code, right? Isn't that what is the pinnacle of all this. Like that's what the story is about. Like that he gives him like.
But Yosef, Yaakov
coat.
did favor Yosef, and the Gemara says that all the problems happened because of that. That's correct. You're right. But then you'd say that my point is that Yaakov should have learned, and yet here it is. He does it again, right? Years and years later to the next generation. And that's because he's not doing it again. In this case, he's showing you that I'm not favoring them. I'm treating them differently. They need more or less attention. They need different things, right? That's the difference in the two, right? Now, as we go on, the next thing that happens is that Yaakov asks that all of his children should be gathered together so he can bless them. And this is a very odd thing, because what happens is as follows. It's a known idea among the peoples of the world, and not just the Jewish people, that when somebody's about to pass on, that they bless their children. That they give a charge to their children, they give their last wishes, whatever that society calls it. In our society, we bless our children, and we give them our last will of what we'd like them to do, and we give them words of inspiration at the end of our lives, right? And he does that here, and we see that Yaakov takes each child and he gives each one of them a blessing. Each one of them. But he does something very odd, which is he tells them, he wants them all gathered together, all 12 sons, and then he blesses each one separately. And some of the blessings, when you read them, are not really very nice blessings. In fact, they're not just blessings. There's a little bit of a reprimand in some of them. There's a little bit of trying to get them to strengthen their weaknesses. Other ones, it's to strengthen their strengths, to help them enrich their strengths. But it's not necessarily nice to each one. Each one has what they need. So you have to wonder, if Yaakov is going to bless each one separately, why does he want all of them to be there when he does it? Why doesn't he bless each one separately and say, okay, send in the oldest, right, the eldest, and then the next one, and the next one, and the next one at a time? Because I'm not blessing them together, I'm blessing them each separately. And what is the purpose of that? And it seems that all that's going to do is, again, cause jealousy, embarrassment. One of them is told you're going to be the leader. Another one says you've lost your role of leader. Another one is you're too fast you're too hot. You get angry you upset too easily. You're very judgmental. Right? Each one is different. And so the commentaries wonder, why does he gather them together so each one should hear? And they tell us that the point is because we need to understand that each one of the brothers were very different. They were very different people, but every one of them were great people. And every great person has flaws, and every great person has strengths. And what makes them great is that they acknowledge their flaws and they work on them, and they acknowledge their strengths and they enrich them. But that each one realizes that with what I have, what God has given me, my troubles, my life, my children, my wife, my finances, is what was specifically for me. And therefore, that each one of us will receive what we need to become the best we can. And even though that there's an idea that as a whole we composed the Jewish nation, and all of them together did compose the Jewish nation, they became the Jews. All of us come from this, all the people standing in that room. Nevertheless, each one of them is different, and each one of them had strengths and weaknesses. So he brings them all together so they all should know that the fact that you have weaknesses is nothing to be embarrassed about. The fact that you have strengths, right, it's something that you should use and that you should use to grow, and it's nothing that you should use to lord over others. The fact that you're handsome, the fact that you're successful in business is not a reason for you to be arrogant. The fact that you have a problem in this area is not a reason for you to be embarrassed. And that each one is given these blessings in front of the others, not so that they should be demeaned in front of the others, so they shall realize that there's no demeaning to it at all. That it is showing that each person, as great as they are, has flaws, and each person, as great as they are, needs to work on themselves. And therefore they were all brought together because each one individually was great, but even more so, each one as a group is much greater. The parts right? The 12 tribes, the sum of the parts, does not come close to the importance and the significance of the whole, of the Jewish nation as a whole. Right? I always say that when you have the ability to try to accomplish a goal, a leader tries to accomplish a goal, and a leader really has a number of ways of accomplishing it. One is that you dictate. You come in and you say, we're all going to move to Israel. Right? That's it. I don't care what you say. We're moving to Israel, and everyone's got to go. Right? Well, people. If you're a strong leader, you're charismatic. You've got a proven record. You might get people to listen to you. Maybe everyone will do it. But if you really want to accomplish it better, the best way is to build a consensus. Even if you believe that the people themselves would not come to the correct consensus on their own, you work with them so that they do come to the right answer. But if you get them to build a consensus where every person contributes and they become unified in the decision that's made, then everyone will do what you want them to do, because it's them. They're a part of it. They have ownership in it. It's not just that I suddenly walk in here and you're telling me I have to do this. I'm coming in and I'm a part of it. And my contribution is important, and what I have to offer is significant, and you know it's significant, and I do, and I know what you have to offer is significant, and therefore when we're together, and we do it through the case of building a consensus, then ultimately we're much stronger than each as individuals. And therefore, while each individual of the tribes was told by their father what their flaws were, what their strengths are, what he sees for them in the future, and some of them had wonderful things said to them, and some it wasn't necessarily so wonderful, the fact is that when they all put those things together and they help each other, they build ultimately a unified goal that is much stronger than each one individually, and each one will become stronger because of it. Now, this is the strength in family. This is the strength in community. This is the strength in a minyan rather than an individual. When we say that when you look at Jewish law, the idea of a man having to pray in shul, right? We know that there's an idea that a man has to pray, and we know there's an idea of praying in a minyan. But the truth is, you can pray at home. You can. You can fulfill the mitzvah of prayer at home. You can't say all of the prayers, but the mitzvah that God wants of us to pray, you can fulfill at home. So when you go to shul to do it, what's the purpose? So there are many reasons, but certainly one of the most important reasons is that when a community prays, the prayer of a community is much stronger than the prayer of all of the individuals within the community. Because together as a group, you're unified, you have more strength, you have much more of ability to accomplish things. And therefore, when we get together as a group in a shul and we pray together to God, we're answered much quicker. Because the 10 people praying together will get an answer much quicker than 10 people praying separately, even though it's the same number of people, because it's the unity that it causes. Now, we learn very, very often in Jewish history that when there was unity among the Jewish people, no matter how low those individuals may have been, they were successful. And when there was disunity among the Jewish people, no matter how great those individuals were, they were not as successful as they could have been, and maybe not successful at all. And which is why we know how important it is for us to build community, to build families, to build a unified group, that Jews should get along with each other, not fight with each other, and how ultimately destructive it is when we don't do that, because it's the unity. That's exactly what Yaakov is telling us. He's telling every one of his sons, each one of you is great, and each one of you will be able to accomplish amazing things. And I'm going to tell you now things to help you along that path. But I'm going to tell you this as a group, not because I'm blessing the group, but because as a group you will be able to accomplish this much better, and you'll do much more, you'll be much greater. And that's why we stress it's so important here in our shul, the idea of community. For many of us, we're not from here, right? We don't have family here. Some of us who are privileged and we have family here, many of us don't have family that live the same lifestyle that we live, and they don't necessarily always understand. I tell people sometimes that with people who become observant, it's very important to remain close to your family and to respect your parents and to care for your family as you always have. However, there are differences For instance, when you have, for instance, two examples that are very common are bar mitzvahs and funerals. Bar mitzvahs and funerals very often in the non-observant Jewish world are celebrated very differently than they are in the observant Jewish world. In the case of a funeral, where if you go to a shiva house, it's sad, but it's almost like a non-Jewish wake. It's almost like a party. People get together and they talk and they'll enjoy themselves. While in a more observant home, that doesn't really happen as much. It certainly happens to some extent, but the atmosphere, the ambiance is very different. It's a much more serious atmosphere, and there are rules of how a shiva house is to be conducted, which changes a lot. Like, for instance, one of the things that you have every time I go to a shiva house or I'm helping arrange a shiva house are always talking about food. They have to have food for the people who come over. But the truth is that according to Jewish law, you're not supposed to eat at a shiva house, unless you're part of the people sitting shiva. But if you're visiting a shiva house, you're really not supposed to eat there. So if you're not supposed to eat at a shiva house, who's all the food being made for? Fact is that most people don't realize this, and therefore when you go to a shiva house, especially in a place that's not as educated, as well-meaning as they are, the food causes a party, and they're not celebrating. I'm making light of it, but the people certainly care for what's happening, but the whole atmosphere is different. And bar mitzvah as well. Bar mitzvah is a serious occasion. While we're celebrating that a young man became bar mitzvah, he is now obligated to do mitzvahs, we certainly would not do it in a way that would break the Torah. But it's not uncommon that there's more celebrating of the celebration than there is of the mitzvah. In many families that are not observant. So when a person becomes observant, their way they want to do these things are different, and their families are not used to it. And as much as you want your family to be a part of things, and you do, and it's very important, you need a community to help you do it, because the community understands. Therefore, to be a part of a community is extremely important. You can't do it alone. You can't get through it alone. In our community, we make sure if somebody has, something good happens to them, the community celebrates with them. Sadly, when things that are not so good happen, the community is there for them. We try, as long as we know, very often people don't tell me, but if we know that somebody is ill, or we know that there's been a loss in a family, our community will make meals for the people, and they'll visit, and they'll call, and they'll be involved in the lives of the people, if the people want them to, of course. But we have to know. But the idea is that a community does that. Our community does it. Many communities do it. But for us, it's extremely important, because if the community doesn't do it, in many cases, there's no one else to do it. So this is the message that Yaakov was sending his sons. That yes, you are all individually great, and I'm blessing you all individually. I'm not blessing you as a group. But you have to know that as a group, the blessings that I gave you as individuals are much more powerful, because you'll accomplish much more. That's really what he says here.
Is that why Menachem and Ephraim, when Yaakov blessed them, he crossed his hands?
Right.
Because Menachem was more
the younger one was going to be greater than the older one, right?
Mm-hmm.
Ultimately. Well, it's because the younger one was. There's a line in the Talmud that says that one of the reasons that there was destruction among the Jewish people is that they didn't give a blessing on the Torah first. They didn't bless the Torah first. Now, usually we think it means the blessings when you get called to the Torah. But one of the commentaries says that it means that when Yaakov wanted to bless Ephraim and Manasseh, he understood that while Ephraim and Manasseh took different paths, and they're both legitimate paths, if we have our choice, the path of Torah is certainly preferred. It's just not necessarily for everyone. And therefore he put his right hand, which is more powerful, on the head of him, the one who would have more of a life of Torah, in order so that he would bless, we'd say the blessing over Torah first, right, over the right hand.
Maybe his soul who really needs what it is.
Excuse me?
Which child needs his needs.
Right, so there's certainly...
like if this one learns Torah, he gives specially this one.
Exactly, and they're both correct ways, but this is correct for him and this is correct for him. Right, that's a good point. So I just want to, I'll give you an example with one of the blessings, how interesting these blessings are. Let's look at the blessing on 279, the last line, the blessing for done. It's one you don't hear much about. Lots of the other ones the people talk about. But this one is rarely spoken about. And here it says, Dan Yadin Amo. It says, Dan will judge his people. Ke'echad Shiftei Yisrael. One of the tribes of Israel. He'll be united as one of the tribes of Israel. Yeh Dan Nachash. Ale derech shefifon al orach haneshach akav Jesus, and it says that Dan will be like a snake who is on the road, who will bite the heel of the horse and throw the rider off the horse. So there's two parts to this, and I'll explain them both, but I really want to comment on the first. The second one is talking about is that Dan is like a snake who will bite the heel of the horse. Right? You know, a horse is stronger than a snake. A horse can stand on a snake and kill it, right? However, the snake can bite the heel of the horse. It can kill the horse. It can attack the horse, right? And throw the rider from the horse. This whole idea is a prophecy. And you see it at the end where Yaakov suddenly changes and he says, Yeshuasecha kavisi Hashem. He says this whole blessing for Dan, and then he says, oh God, I await your salvation, which has nothing to do with the blessing. It tells us that this is actually a prophecy. He's not just talking to Dan. He's telling Dan about something in the future. He's talking about Shimshon, Samson, the story of Samson. That Samson is what's called a failed Messiah. You know, there are things called false messiahs. There's also a thing called a failed Messiah. That is somebody who's supposed to be Mashiach, but either the people cause him to fail or he himself fails. And he's not Mashiach. It doesn't happen. But he was supposed to be Mashiach. Shimshon, Samson, was supposed to be Mashiach. God wanted him to be Mashiach, but he fails. And he ultimately fails. And that's what he's talking about here. That the Philistines, who he goes to war with, are like the horse. He's like the snake. That he ultimately is supposed to bring the Jewish people to fruition, and that the Messiah will come, and the world will be completed. And he fails, and that's why at the end he says, "God, I wait for your redemption, because it's not happening. I see it's not going to happen." But the beginning is interesting. The beginning says, Dan will judge his people. So Rashi tells us on this statement where it says Dan will judge people, it says Yinakum Nakmas Imo. It says that it says Dan will judge his people, and he will, based on the Gemara, it says that is judging, talking about Shimshon, that he'll judge the people who hurt the Jewish people, right? You know, you'll be a judge in a good way. Your judgments will help the Jewish people, right? However, we also know of, you have instances, the Gemara says, it says a story in the Gemara, it says that there was a man, and this man was always going to court. Always going to court, all the time. No matter what would happen, he wanted to go to court. You have people like this in the world. No matter what it is, I'll see you in court. Oh, you do the business with someone, they don't like what you did. That's it. I'm taking you to court, right? They're like all the time is judgment. Like, you can't negotiate with such a person. You can't talk to them. They just want to. This is how it is. This is how it is, right? That's a very bad trait, right? So the Gemara says, no, that's done. What do you mean? That's done. That's what Yaakov is saying to done. That you're going to be like that. But that's not good. And when Rashi describes it very positively. The Gemara describes it negatively, Rashi describes it positively. So what is Yaakov saying? This judgment, this desire for you to be a judge, is it good or is it bad? In one place it sounds good, one place it sounds bad. So the point is that's exactly the answer. Is that Yaakov is describing a personality trait. We all have personality traits. There's a desire for honesty. There's for judgment. There's kindness. There's mercy. We have these traits. They're innate within us. Some of us are kind people naturally. Some of us have to work at being kind. Some of us are generous. Some of us are not so generous. Some of us are strong-willed. Some of us can be pushed over in a second. Right? But each trait can be positive or negative. The same trait of judgment that could be used to defend the Jewish people, that could be helpful. Self-judgment, for instance, is helpful. That I can look within myself, see my own flaws, and try to help myself. is a very good thing. The ability to do that is a very positive thing. But to always bring other people to court, that's a very bad thing. The point being that one has to realize that personality traits, in Hebrew, personality traits are called midos. Midos means weight. It literally means a weight. A midah is a weight, or something that a form of measure. Because how do you measure a person? Based on their personality and how they act. A person is not measured by how beautiful they are, how rich they are. A person is measured by how kind they are, how cruel they are, how easygoing they are, how tough they are, how strong-willed they are, how weak they are. That's how a person is judged. So therefore, the personality traits in Hebrew are called a method of judgment. Right? That's how they are. Therefore, when we talk about Don, who is a person who has the strength of judging, when he judges, he can be judged himself, which is a very positive way of judging, or he can be always forcing others to go to judgment, which is a very negative way of judging. The way you use your traits, that's up to you. You can use them in a way that's good, or they can become very bad. The Rambam says that every trait that a human being has can be used for good or for bad, except for one. The only one that he says that has no good is anger. Anger is a personality trait. That's only bad. He says there is no positive purpose for anger. But every other personality trait can be good or bad. You can be generous, but you can be generous to a fault. You know, somebody could come to you and need tzedakah. You could give away the money you need for breakfast. You won't have food for your children because you give it away because you feel for somebody else. Right? That's, on the one hand, you have to be generous. You have to help people. On the other hand, you have to also have a certain amount of discipline and not give away what you need. Right? You could be strong-willed, and you could also be stubborn. It's the same thing. Right? A person who's strong-willed means I stand up for my beliefs. A person who's stubborn means I don't give in when I'm wrong. It's the same personality trait. So this idea that we're learning here, the difference between how one person interprets the statement of Yaakov to Don and another one interprets it just the opposite, is a purpose to tell us that each personality trait that we have within us, right, can be used positively or negatively. It can make us better people, and we can use it for self-judgment, for being generous, or we could just give away everything. We can judge others. And the same personality trait that can have a positive can have a negative. So one needs to be very careful with our personality traits, that even the negative traits, certainly we have to work on it to strengthen within ourselves. If we're naturally stingy, we have to work on ourselves to become more generous. But if we're naturally generous, we also have to work on ourselves to not be overly generous, not to be giving away what we shouldn't give away. And when we're naturally kind, doesn't mean that we should not stand up for ourselves. You know, a person who doesn't like to make, I don't like to fight with people. I like to make unity. But there's sometimes you have to fight. Right? Sometimes you have to stand up for your beliefs. Sometimes you can't allow people to push you around. Otherwise, you have no reason to be in here. Now, if people are going to, if somebody attacks, one thing if you go and are fighting people all the time, it's a whole other story that somebody's trying to take away what you believe in. And you have to stand up for it. So personality traits are such that even if you have a good trait, you have to work on it in order to make sure that you don't use it badly. You don't use it poorly. That's why Don is said in this way. You can see this with every one of the blessings given to the children. I'll tell you one more, and then you pretty much have to end, even though we've left out 90% of the Parsha. Let's talk about Yisachar, the one right before it, which is line 14 on the same page. Yisachar Chomor. Right? Yisachar is a strong-boned donkey. He rests between the boundaries. He saw tranquility, that it was good, and the land, that it was pleasant. Yet he bent his soldier to bear, and he became an indentured laborer. This is a very odd statement. What did Yisachar do? Yisachar saw that tranquility, rest, is good. So what does he do? He works hard. It doesn't make any sense.
No,
I know.
Hard to rest.
But it's like let's say I'm like a person. I go to work, and I'm going to work every day of my life so that I'll have money to be able to retire. Right? What happens when you retire? Right? What'll happen is that you're going to want to go to work because you've been working your whole life. You're going to be bored. You're going to say, my whole life was my job so that I could retire one day. Now I retire, I'm not working. Right? I have nothing to do. I'm going to read the newspaper 10 times, listen to the sports. What am I going to do all day with my life? But the point is that's what he's talking about here, is that there is two types of tranquility, of what we call menucha. One is what we just described, that I purposely misled you to think that way. That's taking a vacation, right? I took a vacation. I went away for a week. That's fine for a week, for 2 weeks, for 3 weeks. Take a vacation, right? People need it. You have to do that. But if your life is a vacation, right, then that's no life. Life is a struggle. Right? You're supposed to struggle in your life. It's work. You're supposed to, right? And what happens when you struggle? You accomplish, and you receive something from that. When you accomplish something, when you fulfill something, that gives you tranquility also. And that tranquility comes through effort. And that's because when you become a better person, a more knowledgeable person, a kinder person, a smarter person, a more accomplished person, that gives you peace of mind. That's also rest. That's what it says Yisachar saw. Yisachar saw that from the work that you do, the effort you put in Torah, the effort you put into community, the effort you put into others, the effort you put into anything, the result of that gives you real rest. That gives you real peace of mind. Not taking a vacation. That's not what we're talking about. It comes from effort. There was a commercial on television that said that you should drink this milk because it comes from contented cows. Milk of contented cows. Right? And you know what? Cows can be contented. Because what's a cow's life? Right? It's to stand around, can't even sit down, stand around in a field and eat grass all day. So that it should be contented, but people should not be contented. People should be struggling, should be working, should be growing, should be striving to do more, to become better people. Right? Not contented. Because the end result of your struggle and your growth and your work gives you something. That gives you true content. Right? If you have children and you just basically, allow them to do whatever they want until they're old enough to parent themselves, right, then that's because you're taking it easy. You're going to have nothing but trouble. But if you work at your children and you work to make them better and to teach them and help them grow, then in the end you will have true contentment, right? Because you will see what you've accomplished. You've given them a life that they can get ahead, that they can do something for themselves, right? And that gives you contentment. You are content. You're not content by taking it easy, by being a cow standing in the field eating grass. That's for cows. But for people, contentment comes from effort. So it says, Yisachar saw contentment, and he therefore went out to work. He saw the real contentment comes from effort, comes from working on yourself, working for others. That will give you contentment. That's the real thing. That's what that blessing tells us. So I guess we have to stop there. Our time is up. But those are just a few points. And next week we get to start a new book. The book of Shmos, the second book of the Torah, and it introduces us to a whole new way of looking at the Jewish nation, because it creates the Jewish nation. Up until now, this has been the creation of the Hebrews, that thing that eventually become the Jews. But I keep going back and forth on the word. The truth is there are no Jews yet. Jews do not become the Jewish people until the Torah is given. Until then, they're Hebrews. After that point, they become Jews. Although we start to see a change in this parsha that we just finished. I didn't have a chance to explain it, but if you look at the blessing for Yehuda, in there he says that basically we understand that in the blessing of Yehuda, he's told that the future is coming from you, that the Jews will be called by your name. And you'll notice in almost every culture in the world, Jews are called Jews. Right? They're not called Danites or Reubenites or Shimonites. They're called Yehudites, from Yehuda, from Jews, because Yehuda is giving that blessing. In fact, even in the commentary, if you look at Onkelos, who translates the Torah, every place the word referring to the Jewish nation is Ivri, he translates it to the Aramaic word Ivri, which means Hebrew. As soon as it says in here that the blessing for Yehuda, from then on he translates the word as Jews. That's Hebrew. It's no longer Hebrews. Now, from Yehuda. And you see it very quickly in the book of Esther. In the book of Esther, it's very blatant that when the first anti-Semitic statement comes from the queen of Persia, who says, look at the Jews, the Yehudim. He calls us Jews, and then you go to almost any culture in the world. Right? And the Germans, they called us Jews. Right? The Polish, it's all diminutives of the word Yehuda, right? Because that's who we are, and that happens here. That in next week's parsha, you'll see the creation of the Jewish nation. The first book is the creation of the world. The second book is the creation of the Jewish nation.